guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. A lot has happened this past week, actually, and it's made me think of something that is a bit more academic, I guess, but I'm going to totally ground it in the real life. So what it's made me think of is the biopsychosocial model of mental illness. If you've never heard of this, don't worry, I'll break it down. So the biopsychosocial model is kind of the prevailing model of mental illness in the Western world. And it basically says that there are three aspects of our makeup that will lead us to, or that can present and bring us towards mental illness or mental health. The first is the biological, of course. The second is the psychological, and the third is the social. So what this model says is that all three of these aspects will have an effect on our mental health or mental illness, and that it doesn't have to, it's not like it's a triangle where you have to have, at least two of the sides in order for mental illness to form, but it certainly does help. So here's how it looks for me this week. I live obviously with mental illness, and I have varying presentations of my illness. So sometimes I'm well, which I was about a week ago. Sometimes I am very, very ill, and that can be either depressed or manic. And sometimes I'm somewhere in between. So what will happen with me is that I have that biological aspect. So there's that biological predisposition. Somewhere in my genetic makeup, there is the tendency to have this mental illness known as bipolar disorder. Somewhere in my genetics, there is this predisposition. It's a diathesis, right? It's something that's there that could be triggered or not. And so if my life had gone completely perfectly from A to Z and there was no stress, nothing to trigger that gene to kind of turn on, you can imagine a Jessica that would have gone through this perfect life and not had a presentation of mental illness, not had a presentation of bipolar disorder. Now, that's not to say that everyone is the same, right? So having that predisposition, it doesn't mean that everyone that has that predisposition is going to go on to develop bipolar disorder. So just having that predisposition, that biology piece, is not enough. Then there's the psycho part, the psychology part. And what that kind of indicates is, if you've ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy and the different ways of thinking, right? There are certain ways of thinking that are more or less useful to us. There are certain cognitive styles, if you will, that predispose us to either have mental health and wellness, or to be more predisposed to mental illness. And so some of these things like catastrophizing, I mean, we've all heard them kind of in the social milieu, right? Like you've heard of catastrophizing or black or white thinking, those kinds of things that, or perfectionism, even things that the way that you think that makes you maybe not as resilient at certain points in your life. And so you can probably imagine at times in your life when your tendency to be perfectionistic, or your tendency to think that everything, the worst is going to happen, to catastrophize, has maybe led you down a path to not exactly the best mental health. So that's the psychology part. The social part is that part, well, as the name says on the tin, it's the social aspects of our life. So this could be our race, this could be gender, this could be socioeconomic status, where you live, in which country, in which kind of city or suburban area or rural area, in the inner city, whether you live in housing, whether you live with family members. It could be such a variety of things, all of these different things that make up how our society shapes our mental health and our mental illness. And so the idea here is that if you're if the psychology at any given time, remember all of these things can change throughout your life too, right? Like the way that I thought when I was an undergrad, for example, is not the same way that I'm thinking now. I've been through, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's helped me to maybe overcome some of my perfectionism. Don't let my wife be watching this right now, but to overcome maybe some of my black or white thinking, for example. And so these things can change. You can do things to modify these things. Maybe your social housing situation changes over your lifetime, or like for myself, coming out as an LGBTQ2 person has changed my gender and sexual orientation kind of category in the social realm. So these things can change. And so at a given point in time, these three things, the biopsycho and social, interact to help you come to this presentation of your mental health and wellness or mental illness. And so if you have the predisposition for an illness, and you just need the stress that's going to cause that genetic predisposition to come out, you may find that the way that you're thinking about a situation and the situation you find yourself in, the social situation you find yourself in, now predisposes that illness to come out. And that's what happened to me this week. So this week, I actually found that on last Wednesday, I had to take my wife to hospital with symptoms of a heart attack. So she was having crushing chest pains that radiated down her left arm. And that obviously at her age 46, I mean, she's not that old, but nonetheless, it was cause for concern. And so I took her into the emergency room, and they ran all of the tests, and they kept her in, and we were there until 3 a.m, and then they kept her in the Heart Institute, and then I was ferrying my son to and fro and trying to keep him calm and him, get him to school if I could, and keep him safe, and doing all of the things. And so here I have the bio. Right? We know that, like, for the past, since, as I keep mentioning, since August, my bipolar depression and mania have been just like, wee, like this. So that we know that the biology part is primed. It's ready to go. It's ready to tip if the opportunity should arise. So I was doing well, and then the bio part was just ready to just go if it was given the slightest provocation. And then the psychological pieces, I was like, okay, everything's good, we're ready to go. And then this happened to my wife, and I started to think, why does this always happen? Why does this have to happen to us? Why does it happen to me? Maybe I'm a bad person. And that thought processes that I'm working on in therapy started to lead me down a bad path. My social situation hadn't really changed, except for the fact that having someone in hospital is expensive, and I started to worry about, the financial aspect. Oh gosh, how am I going to keep paying for all this parking? And I mean, it seems small, but it was a worry to me. So I started to worry about that, and of course, not having my wife at home to help me with the daily house tasks. So that kind of part of my social aspect, I kind of became a single mother for that time being. And so all of these three things interacted to create the perfect storm of, is Jessica going to relapse into depression? Yeah, she probably is. And so here we are today. And that's what got me thinking about, I'm like, whoa, why did this have to happen to me now? Oh, right, the biopsychosocial model. Because we know that those three things interact to create these interactions of mental health or mental wellness. And I've seen it happen at other points in my life. So not every time that I get an episode of my bipolar disorder can I identify a psychological or a social trigger to that biology piece. Sometimes it seems to be purely biological, if you may. And that's kind of the beauty of the biopsychosocial model, is that it's not like you have to have two of them in order for the triangle to tip. You can have a really predominant, leaning on one of the things. So either like the psychology, the sociology, or the biology, and that can tip you into a period of illness. So it's not like so simple as, well, if you get 2 out of the 3, then you're gonna get ill. It's not that simple. But a lot of the times I can identify either a psychological or sociological trigger for my episodes. So I'll give you an example. When the pandemic hit, You're going to be like, groan, roll your eyes. We don't want to hear about pandemic. I know. But when the pandemic hit, everybody had a hit to their mental health and wellness, right? And that is probably partly because the sociology part of it. So everybody who went from having all these activities, being social butterflies, going out to work, out to the grocery store, out to activities, out to church, wherever, all of a sudden found themselves not able to do any of those things, to see any of those people, to interact in any of those ways. So the social part changed dramatically. The psychological part also changed dramatically. So we went from thinking we were pretty good to being in a constant state of terror and threat, wondering, when our loved ones were going to perish, wondering when we ourselves were going to perish. And so that anxiety and that constant doom scrolling and the constant negative thinking and looking at negative news images and media, that also increased people's anxiety. And so you're seeing the psycho and the social part of that triangle starting to tip really heavily. And that's probably why we saw a lot of not even necessarily mental illness, but mental unwellness during the pandemic. And then why we saw an uptick in mental illness, well, if you imagine this triangle, so now you've got the stressors from from the social and the psycho part of the biopsychosocial model. Anybody that had that tendency, that predisposition to potentially have mental illness, if enough stressors were present, all of a sudden enough stressors were present, right? And so people that had that potential genetic tendency that may never have been triggered otherwise suddenly found it triggered and found themselves having periods of mental illness. And that's what these kinds of things can do. That's why things like war or famine or like huge, societal level events that change out not only our society, but also our psychology, they can just trigger people with the right biology just to become ill. So that happened for me, and it triggered my illness. And while we thought at first, my psychiatrist, my care team, and I thought, oh, it's just kind of everybody's reaction to the pandemic. No, it was a trigger into illness, and we should have known. And so I ended up ill on a depressed episode for 3 years, and even since then I've been on the manic depressed high. So I actually haven't recovered from the episode that was sparked by the pandemic. So it was a very significant episode. And even though a lot of the things like my psychology has returned sort of, to normal, I guess, for me, in terms of I'm not worried about people imminently perishing, and I'm not constantly doom scrolling, and the media is not telling me it's an apocalypse and that kind of thing. And the sociology part has kind of returned to normal too. I'm back to most of my activities. I'm doing, social things that I would have normally done. But still that biology piece was triggered, and it doesn't just as quickly, buoy back up. Once you trigger it, it tends to be triggered for a while. So I hope that was somewhat clear, but that's the biopsychosocial model of Western psychology. And generally speaking, it helps to explain in the way that Western medicine explains mental illness and mental well-being. I would love to see your questions down below, because this is something we cover like every psychology course that I've ever taught or taken. And so if you're here watching this because you are in like Psych 101, I'd love to hear and answer any of your questions down below. And if you've had a similar experience and are kind of like, oh, I wonder how the psychosocial bio part all interacts with that, or if you know now how it interacts, I'd love to hear those experiences down below as well. Take care of yourselves this week. Don't worry, everything's kind of back to normal at my house. We took care of my wife. She's good. No heart attack here. All the alarm bells can stop. And I will take care of myself and my family, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.
StigmaCrusher.